One thing I want to mention right now is that we've got some readings assigned for next week. I'll put those up on the screen here. Next week, we're going to be talking about the restoration of the priesthood. And if you go online into the same folder where you found this video, there will be another folder labeled Class Readings. And right there, there should be a link to the class readings so that you can just click on the text and it'll automatically take you to the place on the internet or on your mobile device where you can do the readings for what we're going to talk about. So we're going to read 3 sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, and then 2 articles about the time and place of the restoration of the priesthood, and then 1 chapter in Saints. Again, feel free to use any audio resources that are available on each one of these. You can listen to the Scriptures or Saints. I'm not sure about the other 2 articles, but both of them are fairly brief, and you should be able to gain access to them, no problem. So let's jump to our subject of what we're going to talk about this week, which is Book of Mormon translation. And right now, as we begin our study, I want you to just start thinking about how you might answer a couple of these questions. Number 1, what do we know about the process of translation that produced the Book of Mormon? Number 2, how do we use physical objects to mediate with the divine? And number 3, what happened to the witnesses of the Book of Mormon in their later lives? So, as we mentioned last week, one of the objects of this class is to take an idea and show how it expanded over the entire history of the church. Now, if we put our timeline of church history up here on the screen, it's very clear that the translation of the Book of Mormon takes place in the beginnings period. The Book of Mormon comes forth from roughly 1823 when Moroni first appears to Joseph Smith to 1830 when it's published and the church is organized. However, as historians, here's a couple signposts that we want to look at, and they're found mostly in the beginnings period and the Church in the West period from 1847 to 1890. So it's 1823 when Joseph Smith visits with the angel Moroni and is first shown the plates. He's given instructions to come back every single year on the same date and receive intelligence and instruction, eventually receive the plates. In 1827, Joseph Smith marries Emma Hale, which is actually an important milestone as he prepares to receive the plates. In 1828, he receives the plates and he begins translation of the plates. He receives them in the fall of 1827, 1828 until April and June. He starts translating with Martin Harris. Joseph Smith then learns that Martin Harris has lost the manuscript of the Book of Mormon, the 116 pages, as Joseph Smith calls it, and there's a lull in translation where it only happens in fits and starts until the spring of 1829. Once Oliver Cowdery shows up in April 1829, we really start to move, and the entire Book of Mormon is translated in a remarkably short period of time. In 1830, the Book of Mormon is published and the church is organized. Now, why is the church in the West up here? Well, a lot of the people that discuss the translation process do so during the Church in the West period. So as historians, we have to be careful to note that a lot of the people that talked about Book of Mormon translation did so sometimes decades after the event took place. That doesn't mean that they're lying or they're not telling the truth, but we can't accept that there might be certain small inaccuracies because they're trying to remember back decades over things that happened. But the Book of Mormon's translation is one of the most well-documented miracles in the history of, well, anything. David Whitmer, Emma Smith, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Smith, the Whitmer family all talk extensively about the translation process. And if we're looking at it as historians, there is some real strength to these reminiscences and the details that they give about how the Book of Mormon came forth. So really quickly, I just want to review our 5 items for determining historicity. I promise we're not going to do this a whole lot more, but I want this to be firm in your mind as we go through the rest of the course to kind of be looking at things with a historical eye as to what's accurate and what's not accurate. And these are 5 ways of determining if a historical account is accurate. So we put these up on the screen last time. The first thing that we would ask ourselves when we're determining historicity is this a primary source? Does it come directly from someone that participated in the event? And when it comes to the translation of the Book of Mormon, there is an embarrassment of riches here. Almost everybody that participated in the translation process was interviewed or wrote an account about it later on. They were very, very specific in their details. The second question we would ask ourselves is it a contemporary account? And this is one place where we might be a little bit careful. Joseph Smith writes his first history of his translation of the Book of Mormon in the first vision in 1832. We're going to actually start in 1830 with section 20 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which is the real first historical account that occurs while we're there. Others come along in 1836, 1847. Most of the people that participate directly in the Book of Mormon process are interviewed in the 1860s or 1870s near the end of their lives. Another thing that we want to be careful with is intent and tone. If a person, when they're speaking, is speaking candidly, if they're being fair, they're being balanced, they're acknowledging their own biases. We also want to look at relationship to other sources. So for instance, other sources can help us tell who was where and when while the Book of Mormon translation was taking place. And understanding the geographic locations of where Book of Mormon translation took place also helps us create in our mind a timeline that helps us know the story of how this occurred. And finally, factual inference. Statements that are based upon relatively indisputable facts. Was there a Whitmer farm in Fayette, New York, and a Smith farm in Palmyra? And was there a Hale farm in Harmony, Pennsylvania? These are the three locations where the Book of Mormon is translated. So let's dive in a little bit to the translation process. And first, again, it's less important to know dates than it is to know sequence. So let's do an overview of how Book of Mormon translation happened, and then we'll dive into the particulars of what occurred. So here's the timeline. I'm indebted to Tony Sweat for helping me put this together. And as we mentioned earlier, it is September of 1827 when Joseph Smith receives the plates. He spends the first couple of weeks acquainting himself with the plates and with the instruments of translation that he's going to use from about September to November. During this time, he is in Palmyra, New York, in his hometown, near the Hill Cumorah, where the book is retrieved. In December, Joseph Smith and Emma decide to move to Harmony, Pennsylvania. This is an area that's still about a 2.5-hour drive from Palmyra, where Joseph Smith lives, and part of the reason why they moved there is to get away from some of the persecutions that surround people trying to get their hands on the plates or steal or obtain the plates from them. So, seeking peace and quiet, they moved to Harmony, Pennsylvania. And around January to about June of 1828, Emma Smith and Martin Harris participate as scribes in helping Joseph Smith translate the Book of Mormon. Around February is when Martin Harris takes some transcribed characters from the plates to New York City. He meets with 3 different scholars. What happens in those meetings is sometimes the subject of dispute. What's not disputable is that Martin Harris comes back convinced and on board with the translation process and begins to act as a scribe. During this time frame, they translate what Joseph Smith later calls the Book of Lehi, or the lost manuscript, or the 116 pages, whichever term you want to use for it. Around that summer, they decide to take a break in June. Martin convinces Joseph Smith to petition the Lord 3 different times to take the manuscript back home to show to his wife, to convince her that he's not wasting his time. Joseph Smith is amenable to this because they're going to have to stop anyway. Emma Smith is pregnant with their first child. Emma gives birth to the baby, but unfortunately the baby dies. Emma almost dies, and that creates the gap where Joseph doesn't hear from Martin Harris for several weeks about the fate of the manuscript. He travels up to Palmyra, New York, and finds out that Martin has lost the manuscript, and Joseph then receives a revelation, section 3 of the Doctrine and Covenants, that rebukes him for losing the plates and takes away his gift to translate. Sometime around September, the plates and interpreters are returned to Joseph Smith, but very little work happens from about September to March. There's sporadic translation with various scribes. We think that Emma Smith's brother, Reuben Hale, assisted during this time. But when we really start to move is in April of 1829, when Oliver Cowdery shows up. Oliver Cowdery shows up, says he feels like he has a calling to help Joseph Smith. They start translating the next day. And the entire Book of Mormon, as we know it, is produced from roughly April until June of 1829. After 2 months translating in Harmony, persecution from Emma's family gets severe enough that they move to Fayette, New York, to a family that Oliver's familiar with, the Whitmer family. And it's there on the Whitmer farm that they finish translation of the Book of Mormon, and that later on they also have the experience with the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses of the Book of Mormon near and around that area in Fayette and Palmyra. So is that clear in your mind? And one thing that should be clear is that there is substantial evidence to indicate the translation time of the Book of Mormon is really short. This is something that Elder Stevenson said at Education Week a little while ago. He said, imagine accomplishing the complete translation of the Book of Mormon and all the additional events just described in about 2 weeks less time than a typical semester at BYU. My conclusion, as a result of my deep dive into the events surrounding the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, is that it is truly a heavenly directed miracle. Its origins are irrefutable. And I would add my testimony to that as well, that it's wonderful to think that the Book of Mormon text that we have comes about in a little less than a semester that happens at BYU. Now, acknowledging the text that we do have, let's acknowledge the text that we don't have. Part of the manuscript of the Book of Mormon was lost and remains lost to this day, partially because of Joseph Smith and Martin Harris's desire to convince people that the work is real. Joseph records this in the 1832 history that we mentioned last week. He said, after we had translated 116 pages, he, Martin Harris, desired to carry them to read to his friends that peradventure he might convince them of the truth. 3 times, therefore, I inquired of the Lord, and the Lord said unto me that he must not take them. And I spoke unto him, Martin, of the word of the Lord, and he said, inquire again. And I inquired again, and also the 3rd time the Lord said unto me, let him go. With them only he shall covenant with me, that he will not show them to only but 4 persons. And he covenanted with the Lord that he would do according to the word of the Lord. Therefore he took them and took his journey, and to his friends in Palmyra, Wayne County, in the state of New York. And he brake the covenant which he made before the Lord, and the Lord suffered the writings to fall into the hands of wicked men. Now, if you were to find an 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon or facsimile, you would see this preface where Joseph specifically mentions the lost manuscript. This is where almost all the information we have about what was in the lost manuscript that comes from a reputable source is found. So you'll notice right here, Joseph Smith mentions that 116 pages were lost. He also calls this the Book of Lehi and says it was an account abridged from the plates of Lehi by the hands of Mormon. Now, 116 pages may just be an estimate. Emer Harris, who was Martin Harris's brother, later on gives a speech where he said he thought it was much longer than 116 pages. Joseph Smith may have specified 116 pages because that was the length of manuscript paper that was replaced by 1 Nephi to Omni, the material on the small plates of Nephi that took the place of what was lost from the Book of Lehi. The other thing that we know is that what was lost, according to Joseph Smith, was an abridgment. So you may have noticed when you're reading the later parts of the Book of Mormon, from about Mosiah onward, there's a 3rd-person omniscient narrator that says, and thus we see, and moves the story along and arranges the historical sources for us to have a nice flowing narrative. It is likely that what was lost was like that it would have been an account of the wars and the histories and the kings of the Nephites, similar to the way the Book of Mosiah, Alma, Helaman, and 3rd Nephi are written. What we have might even be better because it's a direct first-person account that comes from Nephi, that comes from Jacob, that comes from the subsequent prophets that were speaking directly and writing down their own feelings. Someday we will get the lost manuscript. I'll look forward to that. But right now, this is about all we know about that particular manuscript that's lost. What we need to talk about right now is the manuscript that we have and how it was produced. So picture in your mind what you think Book of Mormon translation would have looked like. And probably what you're seeing in your head is a picture like this. This is just one representation. You can find several images like this, church website, official sources. They usually depict Joseph Smith kind of leaning over the plates and looking at the plates, and a scribe on the other side that is writing down the text and taking dictation. Sometimes they'll present a sheet between the two of them, separating them. Sometimes they don't. It varies from place to place. But this is kind of a consistent middle-of-the-line artistic depiction of what translation would have looked like. Now let's go to the historical sources and see if we can create a mental picture from what the witnesses of translation said. So the earliest account of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon is actually found in what is today Section 20 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Before there was a Doctrine and Covenants, this was called the Articles and Covenants of the Church of Christ. And the Articles and Covenants starts with a short little introduction that gives a preview of what has happened so far in the Restoration. Again, this is written around April 1830, around the time that the church is organized. It says this: after it was truly manifested unto the first elder that he had received remission of his sins. Remember our accounts of the first vision from last week? It's possible that what we're reading right here, that very first line, is a direct reference to the first vision. And if it is, it's the earliest reference to the first vision that Joseph Smith makes. It says this: he was entangled again in the vanities of the world, but after truly repenting, God visited him by an holy angel, whose countenance was as lightning, and whose garments were pure and white above all whiteness, and gave unto him commandments, which inspired him from on high, and gave unto him power, by the means of which was prepared before that he should translate a book. So two things that are going to be consistent in Joseph Smith translation's narrative. Number one, that he didn't translate it through intellect, he translated it through power that was given to him. That power was given to him that he could translate the book. He's not saying that he did this through scholarship or through learning. He's always tying this back to a direct kind of sacred, even miraculous power. Which book, it says, contains a record of a fallen people and also the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles and also to the Jews, proving unto them that the Holy Scriptures be true, and also that God doth inspire men and call them to his holy work in these last days, as well as in days of old, that he may be the same God forever. Amen. The exact next verse mentions that Joseph Smith is not alone in this endeavor, that though he's the main translator, that there are several people responsible for bringing the Book of Mormon text to us in its current form. The text says, this book, given by inspiration, is called the Book of Mormon, and is confirmed to others by the ministering of angels and declared unto the world by them. So we're going to talk first about what Joseph Smith said about translation, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what others said about the translation process that were there and may have witnessed it firsthand. So first things first, Joseph Smith, when he talked about translation, at least in his statements, seems most concerned with helping us understand that there were actual plates. He gives dimensions, he gives sizes. Here's a sample of a history that he gave. This is from the 1842 history we talked about last week, the Wentworth letter. And he goes out of his way to describe the plates. He says, these records were engraven on plates which had the appearance of gold. Each plate was 6 inches wide and 8 inches long and not quite so thick as common tin. They were filled with engravings in Egyptian characters and bound together in a volume as the leaves of a book with 3 rings running through the whole. The volume was something near 6 inches in thickness, a part of which was sealed. The characters on the unsealed part were small and beautifully engraved. The whole book exhibited many marks of antiquity and its construction and much skill in the art of engraving. With the records was found a curious instrument which the ancients called Urim and Thummim, which consisted of 2 transparent stones set in the rim of a bow fastened to a breastplate. So he's talking about concrete objects and articles. Here's the plates, here's what they look like, here's the instrument that I used to translate, here's what they look like. And then when he describes the translation process, Joseph Smith usually used the same phrase, which was this: through the medium of the Urim and Thummim, I translated the record by the gift and power of God. So that's a statement from Joseph Smith, the most first-hand person that we know of, the most direct participant in the translation process, who's there every single day that the Book of Mormon is being translated. The next person who is most involved in the translation process is Oliver Cowdery. And one of the most frustrating things about Book of Mormon historiography is that the 2 people that are most involved in translation, Joseph and Oliver, are the 2 people that die young, and we don't have an opportunity to talk to them very much about what they say. Joseph Smith dies in 1844. Oliver dies in 1848. A lot of the other witnesses, like the Whitmer family or Emma Smith, we don't get around to talking to until the 1860s and 70s. But here's what Oliver Cowdery said. And remember, he's the scribe during almost the entire time that the Book of Mormon itself is translated. Oliver leaves the church in 1838. He returns in 1848. When he comes back into the church, he sits down with a man named Reuben Miller at winter quarters, and Reuben Miller transcribes this testimony. Oliver Cowdery said, I wrote with my own pen the entire Book of Mormon, save a few pages, as it fell from the lips of the prophet Joseph Smith, as he translated it by the gift and power of God, by the means of the Urim and Thummim, or as it is called by the book, holy interpreters. I beheld with my eyes and handled with my hands the gold plates from which it was translated. I also beheld the interpreters. The book is true. Sidney Rigdon did not write it. Solomon Spaulding did not write it. I wrote it myself as it fell from the lips of the prophet. So Oliver Cowdery uses 2 similar things here too. He talks about the plates and that the plates are real. He talks about the Urim and Thummim, and he even specifies that they are assigned in the book or discussed in the Book of Mosiah, as holy interpreters. He also says that he handled with his hands the gold plates, and that he also handled and held the interpreters, and dismisses 2 popular theories from his own lifetime. One was that Joseph Smith was too unlearned, so Sidney Rigdon must have written it. The other one was that Solomon Spaulding wrote it. Both of these have been discredited. Sidney Rigdon always testified that he was never involved in translation. We actually found Spalding's manuscript, and it didn't have any relationship to the Book of Mormon. Now, other people sat down and talked with Oliver Cowdery while he was still alive about Book of Mormon translation. But we're more careful with some of these accounts because they come a little bit later on. For instance, this is from a man named Samuel Whitney Richards, who spoke with Oliver Cowdery at winter quarters, but does not write down his experiences until 1907. So because this is a little bit more distant, we're going to be a little bit more cautious with it, but it does seem to line up with what Reuben Miller writes at the same time when he meets Oliver Cowdery in winter quarters. So Samuel Whitney Richards relates that Oliver represented Joseph Smith as sitting by the table with the plates before him, and he reading the record with the Urim and Thummim. Oliver, his scribe, sits close to hear and write every word is translated. This is done by holding the translators over the words of the written record, and the translation appears distinctly in the instrument. Every word was made distinctly visible to every letter, and if Oliver did not in writing spell the word correctly, it remained in the translator until it was written correctly. This was a mystery to Oliver, how Joseph, being comparatively ignorant, could correct him in spelling without seeing a word written. So the way he relates it here is that the text would actually appear inside the instrument of translation, that the words were right there, they were told the exact words to use, and that the word would stay until Oliver Cowdery had spelled them correctly, and then a different word would appear. So again, we're not talking about a traditional translation process. We're talking about something that's miraculous, where words are appearing in the instruments that Joseph Smith is using, and those words are being written down with exactness by Oliver Cowdery. A lot of historians favor this approach because it seems to indicate that the text of the Book of Mormon was a very tight translation. Sometimes historians go back and forth between the idea that Joseph Smith was allowed to sort of come up with the words he was going to use, and others saying he was given the exact words that he was supposed to use. Now, Joseph Smith does, in his lifetime, go through and make minor corrections to the text of the Book of Mormon. We don't know the exact reason for this, but statements from him, Oliver Cowdery, and other witnesses seem to indicate that it's a tight translation process. That if it says adieu in the book of Jacob, it's because adieu appeared in the instrument and Oliver was told to write it down and spell it exactly the way that it was. Now, interestingly, Oliver Cowdery's wife also was one of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon. She's a part of the Whitmer family during this time. He marries her later on, so she's present and around. And later on in her life, this is in 1870, she is asked about the translation process, and she said this: "I cheerfully certify that I was familiar with the manner of Joseph Smith's translating the Book of Mormon. He translated most of it at my father's house, and I often sat by and saw and heard them translate and write for hours together. Joseph never had a curtain between him and his scribe while he was translating. He would place the director in his hat, and then place his face in the hat so as to exclude the light, and then read the words as they appeared before him." So Elizabeth gives a slightly different account here. She doesn't mention that there was any kind of sheet between Joseph Smith and the person that was acting as his scribe. That doesn't mean that that didn't happen. It may have happened in other places when Elizabeth wasn't there, like Harmony or Palmyra. She's just saying what she saw at the Whitmer farm as a young woman. She also talks about the words appearing in the instruments without necessarily having to be placed over the top of the plates, like that earlier statement that we relate back to Oliver Cowdery. Elizabeth's family members recorded similar statements as they describe what translation looked like. So remember, in our timeline of Book of Mormon translation, about the last month the Book of Mormon translation takes place on the Whitmer farm in upstate New York at Fayette. So these people are seeing Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery when they're comfortable, when they're down with the process, when they understand exactly what to do, and they're moving quickly through it. So let's see what Elizabeth's brother David had to say about it. David Whitmer is one of the three witnesses of the Book of Mormon. We're going to talk a little bit about him. Near the end of his life, he writes a public account of translation of the Book of Mormon, and here's the way he describes translation. He said this: "Joseph Smith would put a seer stone into a hat and put his face in the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light. And in the darkness, a spiritual light would shine. A piece of something resembling parchment would appear, and on that appeared the writing. One character at a time would appear, and under it was the interpretation in English." In other words, what David Whitmer saw was Joseph Smith receiving the text directly off the seer stone. A friend of mine, Anthony Sweat, has done a painting of what this may have looked like based on David's description, and here's what it may have looked like. Joseph Smith is receiving the text through divine revelation, and not through any kind of normal translation process that we know of. And that's one thing to keep in mind, is that all the people are testifying here that they saw and beheld something miraculous. Don't lose the forest for the trees as we talk about the differences in the accounts, and forget the fact that every single person is testifying that the Book of Mormon really does come from God. But David Whitmer, for instance, would have been one of those people that favored a very tight translation of the Book of Mormon. Here's the way he describes it. He said, Brother Joseph would read off the English to Oliver Cowdery, who was the principal scribe, and when it was written down and repeated to Brother Joseph to see if it was correct, then it would disappear, and another character with the interpretation would appear. Again, this idea that the text is coming directly to Joseph Smith and very clearly through a translation instrument. One of the interesting things is that David Whitmer relates that one of the reasons why he left the church was because Joseph stopped using these seer stones when he received his revelation. So a seer stone sometimes seems really strange to us, but to someone like David Whitmer, it was proof that Joseph Smith was engaging in a miraculous process. When Joseph Smith started to receive revelations without a seer stone, that caused David to doubt and caused problems for him later on. Another important witness of the Book of Mormon that we don't want to discount is Emma Smith. After Oliver Cowdery, she's the person that's present for most of Book of Mormon translation. In fact, she may have been there more than Oliver Cowdery because she's at the hill when Joseph Smith receives the plates. She goes with his family in Palmyra. Then they move to be with her family down in Harmony, and that's where most of the lost manuscript of the Book of Mormon is translated. And then the next year, most of the Book of Mormon as we know it is translated while they're in Harmony. Emma testified several times throughout her life about the translation process and how it worked. But let me show you something right now that's kind of special. Emma's papers ended up with the Community of Christ, formerly known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They have a really nice historical collection in Independence, Missouri at their world headquarters, and one of the things that they have here are notes from an interview that Joseph Smith III, this is the son of Joseph and Emma Smith, carried out with Emma Smith February 4th through 10th in 1879. So this is near the end of Emma's life, and her son is sitting down with her one last time to try and record her recollections on what happened in early church history. So you can see over on the side some of the notes that he took. He also took notes in pencil, so you can see some of the questions that some of the answers on this paper that he wrote down here. I'll put up the questions so that you can kind of see what he was asking him at the same time. So you can see, for instance, one of the first questions that he asked right here. He asked where his mom and dad got married. Then he asked, when did you meet Sidney Rigdon? Emma Smith describes residing at the house of Father Whitmer. When I met Sidney Rigdon, she claims the Book of Mormon had already been translated and published by the time Rigdon shows up. The next question that he asked her was, who were the scribes for Joseph Smith during the translation process? She said, myself, Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, and Reuben Hale. Now, this seems to stand up closely with examination of the manuscript of the Book of Mormon as we have it. Though some of the Whitmers may be involved, and there's a few scribes that haven't been identified, Emma's pretty accurate in saying that she beheld the translation process and was familiar with most of the scribes that are involved in assisting Joseph Smith. Now, near the end of his interview, her son asks her, do you believe that the Book of Mormon comes from God, or is it possible that you were deceived? These are his notes of what his mother said when she was asked directly that question, do you think that the translation process was real? Now, it's a little hard to read these paper notes, so I've transcribed this. You can go back and look at this. This is exactly what it says on the page. She said this, my belief is that the Book of Mormon is of divine authenticity. I have not the slightest doubt of it. I am satisfied that no man could have dictated the writing of the manuscript unless he was inspired. For when acting as his scribe, your father would dictate to me hour after hour. And when returning after meals or after interruptions, he could at once begin where he left off, without either seeing the manuscript or having any portion of it read to him. This was a usual thing for him to do. It would have been improbable that a learned man could do this. For one so ignorant and unlearned as he was, it was simply impossible. So she relates some things that are almost unbelievable here, that when she was acting as Joseph Smith's scribe, and as President Nelson mentioned in General Conference a few years ago, we think she was the first and one of the most important scribes, especially in the lost manuscript portion of the Book of Mormon. She said that Joseph Smith was able to stop in mid-sentence and leave for several hours and then come back and pick up right where he had left off in mid-sentence. If Joseph Smith is making this up off the top of his head, it's almost inconceivable that he could have that kind of memory. She also, a person that's married to him that knows him very, very well, said that she just didn't think this was the sort of thing that he could create on his own. In fact, she says it was simply impossible. So again, from a spouse that knows Joseph very, very well, she just doesn't see any way that he could have faked this or made it up. Now, interestingly, we do have a portion of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. This is a picture I took of a page of the Book of Mormon that is on display at the Church History Library in Salt Lake City right now. This is from 1 Nephi 4, and you can see here where Oliver, who's the scribe for this portion of the manuscript, is writing down as Joseph Smith dictates things. There's all kinds of indications in the portions of the original manuscript that we have that it was a dictation. For instance, there are several places where difficult or complicated words like the name Coriantumr, Oliver Cowdery misspells several times, crosses it out, goes back and writes it correctly as if Joseph Smith is telling him exactly how to spell the proper names. Because let's be honest, names like Coriantumr and Gidgidoni aren't going to be something that you know how to spell the first time. According to Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Smith would spell those proper names out. And according to all the other witnesses, he would wait until his scribe had written down things appropriately. Now, one of the problems and challenges that we do have is that of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon, not much of it still exists. This page that you see right here is one of the most complete examples. This is another fragment from the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. This belongs to a collector that lives in Provo. He allowed me to take a picture of it. This is an excerpt from Alma 60, 6 through 8, and verses 16 through 17. But you can see here that most of the manuscript actually disintegrated or was destroyed in the 19th century. Not because anybody was being malicious, because they were actually trying to preserve it. When they got to Nauvoo, Joseph Smith took the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon, and he placed it in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house, this big hotel that they're building in Nauvoo. It's a significant building. He's thinking if it's placed here, it's going to be kept safe. Unfortunately, the Nauvoo house was right next to the Mississippi River, and water creeped into the cornerstone and destroyed most of the manuscript. Then afterwards, Emma Smith's second husband, Louis Bideman, actually would take portions of the manuscript and give it away as souvenirs to people that stayed in his hotel. Because of that, we have about 28% of the original manuscript. What we do have is the entire printer's manuscript, because after the Lost Manuscript episode, Joseph Smith asked Oliver Cowdery and Hiram Smith to create an entire copy or transcription of the original manuscript. That exists. It was actually given to the church, sold to the church by Community of Christ, and is in our custody, and the entire manuscript can be viewed at the Joseph Smith Papers website. There's a couple other documents surrounding Book of Mormon translation that I'd like to talk about too. For instance, maybe you have seen this in books or pictures of it or anything like that. This is a picture that I took. This is what's called the characters document, spelled that way because of the way characters is written up on the top. This is a document that several people have said, including John Whitmer himself, belonged to John Whitmer. We think that this was created late in the Book of Mormon translation process. Most scholars believe that what you're seeing here are authentic characters from the plates of the Book of Mormon. Now, are we able to translate them? No, nobody knows Reformed Egyptian right now, but it's interesting that documents like this were created during Joseph Smith's lifetime and kind of witness that there were actual plates that Joseph Smith was translating from. What we're kind of having a dispute about right now is how did Joseph Smith actually translate? Because you may have noticed that some of the accounts we've already read talked about a Urim and Thummim or divine interpreters as described in the Book of Mormon, and some of them talk about a seer stone. So let's dive right into the controversy there for just a second. As we mentioned, some of the historical accounts mention divine interpreters. Joseph Smith himself describes two clear stones kept in a bow. Other people describe them as divine spectacles, something that looks like a pair of glasses. Other people, like David Whitmer and Emma Smith, describe a seer stone. In 2015, as part of the Joseph Smith Papers project, the church published the first images of this seer stone. Now, full disclosure, I should note that there are several seer stones in the possession of the church that people claim were connected to Joseph Smith that the church hasn't put out there as authentic seer stones. This one they have, and partially because we have a very clear provenance. Provenance means that we can connect an item to a specific historical person. So if someone walks up to you and says, I have George Washington's hat, you don't need to take them at face value. You should ask, what's the provenance? How do you know this is George Washington's hat? A lot of times it turns out that it's not, or they can't prove that it is. This little stone, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, does have a clear provenance, and I'll describe that in just a second. But first, let's describe the interpreters. It appears that Joseph Smith used the interpreters early on in the translation process, then the seer stone in the later part of the translation process. The Book of Mormon Mormon calls these two stones the interpreters in the Book of Mosiah and the Book of Alma, and it appears to be a Urim and Thummim, or interpreter, that was given to the brother of Jared, and then passed down through the Nephite prophets, and finally sealed up with the record itself. Joseph describes the interpreters as two stones and silver bows for the purpose of translating a book. That's in the 1838 history we talked about last week. Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph Smith's mother, who's actually one of the most important sources for this early history of the Book of Mormon, had an experience with these that she described as follows. So after Joseph Smith brings the plates and the interpreters back home to his parents' house, which is only about a mile away from the Hill Cumorah, Lucy Mack Smith is just absolutely frightened all the time. He doesn't even come in with the plates the night that he retrieves them. He says that he hides them in the forest. And just like any mother or any reasonable person would, she is just sick with worry that Joseph doesn't have the plates with him at all time, and she worries that someone's going to find the plates and take them. According to her own history, Joseph, to kind of assuage her concern, said, "Do not be uneasy, all is right." She writes, said he, "I have got a key." And she writes, "I knew not what he meant, but I took the article in my hand, and examining it with no covering but a handkerchief, found that it consisted of two smooth three-cornered diamonds set in glass, and the glass was set in silver bows, connected with each other in the same way that old-fashioned spectacles were made." So she doesn't see the Urim and Thummim, but Joseph Smith hands these interpreters to her in a silk handkerchief, and she feels them through it, and that's where she gives her description. It's clear that early on Joseph Smith used these interpreters to see where the Book of Mormon was and keep the plates themselves safe so that they wouldn't be stolen or taken or affected in any other way. Now, that's the narrative that most members of the church are familiar with, that Joseph Smith used the holy interpreters to translate the Book of Mormon, and that that's the end of the story. But from the beginning, there has always been a side narrative as well that talks about the use of a seer stone. The official Gospel Topics essay, the one that you read for today, says this: "For convenience, Joseph often translated with a single seer stone rather than the two stones bound together to form the interpreters." Martin Harris, one of the early scribes of translation, also said that he remembered that Joseph Smith possessed a seer stone by which he is enabled to translate as well from the Urim and Thummim, and for convenience he then used the seer stone. So apparently this is a seer stone that Joseph Smith already has in his possession, that he's comfortable using, that he occasionally switched off to use instead of using the interpreters during translation process. The sources on where the seer stone comes from are a little bit shaky, but one person named Willard Chase, who grew up with Joseph Smith, said that Joseph Smith discovered this seer stone while digging a well on his property in 1822, and that Joseph Smith was able to use this seer stone in certain business occasions when he's asked by a man named Josiah Stoll to try and locate a Spanish mine, and other things in order to carry out his work. Joseph Smith may have used this as one of the instruments in translation, and like I said, this particular seer stone has been in church custody for quite a while. In fact, in the early 20th century, when B.H. Roberts wrote the Comprehensive History of the Church, he apparently saw the seer stone itself. It was in the custody of First Presidency then. He described the seer stone as follows. He said, "The seer stone referred to here was chocolate-colored, somewhat egg-shaped stone, which the prophet found while digging a well in company with his brother Hiram. It possessed the qualities of Urim and Thummim, since by means of it, as described above, as well as of the interpreters found with the Nephites record, Joseph was able to translate the characters engraven on the plates." Now you might notice here a little verbal tick that B.H. Roberts displays that appears Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery used. It was describing both the seer stone and the Nephite interpreters as objects that possess the qualities of Urim and Thummim. Urim and Thummim is a Hebrew term that means lights and perfections. It seems like they used Urim and Thummim to describe any instrument that they used to translate the Book of Mormon. Now, how do we know that this is authentic provenance? This particular seer stone that you're seeing up on the screen right now, apparently, at the end of the translation process, was given to Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery kept it in his possession until he died in 1850. In 1850, it came into the possession of his wife, Elizabeth Whitmer Cowdery, at which point Elizabeth contacted one of Oliver's close friends, a man named Phineas Young. Phineas Young took possession of the seer stone and then gave it to his brother, Phineas Young's brother was Brigham Young, his little brother who's president of the church. Ever since that time in the 1850s, the seer stone has been in continuous institutional possession of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that's part of the reason why we feel confident saying that this probably is, there's no way to know for sure, but probably is an object, an instrument that Joseph Smith used and was familiar with. Now, if we have this, the question is, have we fired it up to see what it can do? Have we tried to translate anything? No, we have not. The last time that the seer stone was used apparently was at the dedication of the Manti Temple when Wilford Woodruff placed it on the altar while he was dedicating the temple itself. It wasn't used in the dedicatory service, and we don't know exactly what its function is now or what we could use it for. It's just nice to know that it's there and it's in possession of the church, and they published pictures of it. These pictures, by the way, were in the inside in almost every official church magazine. You can go to the Joseph Smith Paper site right now and pull up a picture of it. The church has been very open in showing and demonstrating this. Now, to a lot of people, it might seem kind of odd to say that Joseph Smith used a seer stone as opposed to the Nephite interpreters. Most of us that grew up inside the church are used to the narrative where the Urim and Thummim are just the Nephite interpreters, that those two terms are interchangeable, and that's it. Well, there's a good reason for that. Part of it is the two people most involved in translation, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, tended to favor the term Urim and Thummim and Nephite interpreters. When Joseph Smith describes translation, he generally talks about the Nephite interpreters and doesn't mention the seer stone. When Oliver Cowdery describes translation, he talks about the interpreters and not the seer stone. Because Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery are the two people most involved in translation, that became our narrative. The other thing was that people like Emma Smith and David Whitmer, who talk a lot about the seer stone, were people that stayed outside the church. Emma never comes west, neither does David Whitmer. Both of them become disaffiliated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they're the ones that discuss the use of the seer stone. And so when we created our translation narrative in the 19th century, we tended to be doubtful of what they said and exclude them. In the 20th century and in our time, it became more common for historians to look and say that David and Emma were both credible witnesses. They were both there. They both saw things firsthand. And maybe most importantly for a person of faith, it doesn't seem like they were trying to discredit the Book of Mormon at all. They were describing it as a miraculous translation. And that's caused us to circle back to some of these narratives and say, well, why don't we trust Emma and David? They're trying to testify that the Book of Mormon is true, so let's pay attention to their sources. The other thing that maybe seems odd to us today is that we're not familiar with using things like seer stones or divining rods, but that was part of the world that Joseph Smith grew up in. So sometimes when we make historical judgments, we need to pause for just a second and say, that might seem a little strange to me right now, but was it strange in the 1830s or 1820s? Was it strange in the area where Joseph Smith grew up? A few years ago, two really good historians, Mike McKay and Nick Frederick, actually went back and reviewed contemporary documents from Palmyra and the surrounding area, and they found out that there were about 11 people that had seer stones that were being used for various purposes. A lot of them used them in similar ways that Joseph Smith did, like putting it into a hat and then excluding light so that they could see and receive revelations. They were used from everything from fantastical things like seeking out buried Spanish gold to pretty mundane things like trying to find water sources. And it seems like Joseph Smith was in, well, fairly good company to use these sorts of seer stones. This is the world that he grew up in. It's possible that the Lord saw Joseph Smith's cultural context that he existed in and then used that to try and help and instruct him and show him how to translate using the seer stone. One other thing that we've mentioned is that it appeared that it was very, very important to the people around Joseph Smith that there was some sort of evidence of a miraculous translation like the Whitmer family, and that might be another reason why the seer stone was used. The only thing I'm trying to say here is that there's nothing disturbing about using the seer stone. It seems weird to us right now because we're not familiar with this particular narrative, but if a person didn't know about Nephite interpreters, that might seem really odd to them too. The point that we need to kind of fixate on here is that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon through miraculous means, that it's not an intellectual, it's not a scholastic, it's not any kind of normal translation, it's a miraculous translation. And I might point out too that the idea that we use objects sometimes to interact with God and receive revelation from Him isn't really that strange. A couple of years ago, President Dallin H. Oaks said this: "It should be recognized that such tools as the Urim and Thummim, the Liahona, seer stones, and other articles have been used appropriately in biblical, Book of Mormon, and modern times." So it might have seemed weird if you could travel back in time to the Nephite dispensation and have them talking about a divine compass that gives them direction when they're faithful and has words appear on it from time to time. It might seem strange if you went back and talked to Moses and they talked about how they had a sacred ark where they kept holy objects, or that Moses himself used a kind of Urim and Thummim to receive revelation. But all this is consistent and scriptural. In fact, even in the church today, if we asked ourselves, what physical objects do we use to mediate with divine power? There are several physical objects that we still use and we believe gain divine power. For instance, why does a person long to go to the temple? Why does a person go to the temple and put names on the prayer roll of the temple? Isn't a prayer outside the temple just as effective as a prayer inside the temple? Well, we believe that the temple has a sacred space and a sacred place to it. Why do we use consecrated oil when we give a blessing to someone? It's not because we believe that oil has any kind of medicinal quality. It's because we believe that consecrated oil can do something, that it has greater power and allows us to mediate and connect with the divine. One thing that's been interesting the last couple of weeks in the historical context we're in right now is to bless and partake of the sacrament every Sunday in my home with my family under the direction of our local ecclesiastical leaders. Do we believe that bread and water has any particular powerful qualities that make it more likely to allow a person to connect with God? Not really, but we believe that bread and water that has been made sacred through the prayers that are written in the scriptures and prayed over by people that have authority does have the power to connect us with God. Now, I want to be clear, we don't believe in transubstantiation, that the bread turns into the flesh of Christ, or that the water becomes the blood, but we do believe that these objects become sacred ways of connecting with the divine. It's really not all that different to say that Joseph Smith used a stone, or Nephite interpreters, or plates in order to receive the text that becomes the Book of Mormon that helps us understand it. The other thing, too, is even though these talk about the Book of Mormon being received directly by revelation through these instruments, we don't want to discount the importance of there being an actual physical record. So knowing that we couldn't possess the record itself, God made provision for several people to testify of the Book of Mormon, and this becomes one of the most important evidences that the story is true. So let's talk a little bit about the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, and a couple things you might want to read here are sections 11 through 12 and 14 through 17 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which are given specifically to people that serve as witnesses of the Book of Mormon. Section 17 is given specifically to the three witnesses of the Book of Mormon and actually spells out right there in the text of the Doctrine and Covenants what they are going to see and behold. And in every edition of the Book of Mormon, since it was published in 1830, either in the very front of the book right now or in the back of the book as it was published in 1830, are the testimony of the three witnesses. So let's talk a little bit about the experience that they have. According to the best sources that we have, it appears that the experience with the three witnesses happens somewhere on the Whitmer farm. We don't know the exact location, but Lucy Mack Smith, who's kind of our most reliable historical source at this time, says that Joseph Smith picked a particular day, followed the instructions that were given in the book of Ether in Ether 5, and chose three witnesses to serve as the witnesses of the Book of Mormon. These men were blessed to not only see the plates, but also see the angel, to see the objects that are listed in section 17 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which included the sword of Laban, the miraculous director, the Liahona, and also hear the voice of God testifying. Lucy writes specifically about what she saw that day on the farm, and here's what she witnesses. She said that Joseph came in and threw himself down beside me and exclaimed, "Father, Mother, you do not know how happy I am. The Lord has now caused the plates to be shown to three more besides myself. They have seen an angel who has testified to them, and they will have to bear witness to the truth of what I have said. For now they know for themselves that I do not go about to deceive the people, and I feel as if I was relieved of a burden which was almost too heavy for me to bear. And it rejoices my soul that I am not any longer to be entirely alone in the world." So first of all, this is being made up. Academy Awards all around. Everybody's giving a great performance here, including Joseph Smith, who is incredibly relieved that finally someone else has seen the plates and has to carry the burden that he's been carrying for the last few years, that the plates exist and that the angel is real and that God has been watching over the process. Now, the three men are Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer. And each one of them has a really, really unique experience that we need to describe. Most of you know that when the four of them, Joseph, Oliver, David, and Martin, all kneel down to pray, there is no response at first. Martin Harris feels like he's the problem, so he leaves. He leaves, and when he leaves, immediately David, Joseph, and Oliver have this experience burst upon them where they see the angel, hear the voice of God, and behold the objects related in section 17. After that is finished, Joseph sends David and Oliver back to the house. He finds Martin Harris a short distance off praying as well. They kneel down together, and the same experience is repeated. So really 2 experiences happen here, one with Joseph, David, and Oliver, and then one a few moments later with Martin Harris. Let's talk about the life history of each one of these witnesses and how it testifies to the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. So here's Martin Harris. This is an actual photograph taken late in his life. Martin Harris is faithful. He even participates in choosing the original quorum of the 12 and serves in several important positions in the church. But in 1838, he leaves the church. We don't think he was ever excommunicated. In fact, his descendants stay inside the church. Dallin H. Oakes, the H stands for Harris. He's a descendant of Martin's brother, Emer, who stays in the church. For several years, Martin associates with a number of apostate groups. He never denies his testimony in the Book of Mormon, and he bounces between several different apostate groups, even going on a mission for the Strangites. Martin Harris finally winds up in Kirtland, Ohio, living by himself and kind of acting as the custodian of the Kirtland Temple. In fact, I have a friend who works at the Kirtland Temple. He took me up into the rafters and showed me a few places where people had carved their names into the rafters to signify that they were there. And I don't know if this was him, but there was a gigantic M and H carved into one of the rafters that we think Martin may have done during the years that he lived in Kirtland. Well, near the end of his life, several missionaries passed through town and they asked to meet with Martin Harris. They invite him to come back to Utah and rejoin the church, which he does in 1870. He lives to be 92 years old and never denies his testimony of the Book of Mormon. In fact, here is an example of Martin Harris's testimony of the Book of Mormon. He was asked specifically if he still believed in the witness that was written. He said, "The Book of Mormon is no fake. I know what I know. I've seen what I've seen and I've heard what I heard. I have seen the gold plates from which the Book of Mormon is written. An angel appeared to me and others and testified to the truthfulness of the record. And had I been willing to have perjured myself and sworn falsely to the testimony I now bear, I could have been a rich man, but I could not have testified other than I have done and am now doing, for these things are true." Martin Harris moved to a little tiny town in northern Utah in the Cache Valley named Clarkson. And you can drive to Clarkson today if you live in the United States and visit his headstone. This is a few years ago when I went and visited the headstone of Martin Harris. You can even see in the background my son right there walking around looking at the obelisk that kind of sits on his grave. On one side is printed the text of the statement of the 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon. Never denies his testimony, but he does come back into the church. Now, the second one is Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery, like Martin Harris, is excommunicated in 1838. Are you seeing a similar pattern here? There's a major apostasy that happens in 1838, and this is where we lose a lot of the early important witnesses of church history. Oliver Cowdery moves to Ohio, becomes a lawyer, becomes active in politics. As we mentioned earlier in the lecture, he rejoins the church in 1848. He never has the opportunity to travel west. Oliver's in ill health. Instead of traveling west from winter quarters, he travels south to Missouri to stay with his in-laws, the Whitmer family. Remember, his wife is a Whitmer sister. She's sisters with all the other witnesses of the Book of Mormon. As far as we know, he never denies his testimony. In fact, one powerful thing that happened to him, a missionary named Jacob Gates is traveling west. He's traveling east to go on a mission to Europe, and he stops in Richmond, Missouri to visit with Oliver Cowdery. This is only about 2 or 3 months before Oliver passes away. And he said this. He asked Oliver directly, "Is the Book of Mormon true? Do you still stand by your witness?" This is what he said happened. He said to question him, Oliver, thus seemed to touch him very deeply. He answered not a word, but arose from his easy chair, went to the bookcase, took down a Book of Mormon of the first edition, turned to the testimony of the 3 witnesses, and read in the most solemn manner the words to which he had subscribed his name nearly 20 years before. Facing my father, he said, "Jacob, I want you to remember what I say to you. I am a dying man, and what would it profit me to tell you a lie? I know," said he, "that this Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God. My eyes saw, my ears heard, and my understanding was touched. And I know that whereof I have testified is true. It was no dream, no vain imagination of the mind. It was real." Interestingly, The person that was closest to Oliver Cowdery in all phases of his life was his wife, Elizabeth Whitmer Cowdery. She was also asked if Oliver ever denied his testimony of the Book of Mormon, and here's what she said a little bit later on towards the end of her life. She said, "My husband, Oliver Cowdery, bore his testimony of the truth and divine origin of the Book of Mormon as one of the three witnesses of the Book of Mormon. As to his standing on doctrine, he stood where he did when he preached the first sermon that was preached in the last days in the Church of Christ in 1829, when the Bible and the Book of Mormon alone were the guide to the faith of the church. From the hour when the glorious vision of the Holy Messenger revealed to mortal eyes the hidden prophecies which God had promised his faithful followers should come forth in due time, until the moments when he passed away on earth, he always, without one doubt or shudder of turning, affirmed the divinity and truth of the Book of Mormon." Now, Oliver Cowdery's grave is a little bit harder to locate. He was buried in a cemetery in Richmond, Missouri, where the Whitmers lived. The cemetery, unfortunately, was washed through with a flash flood. A lot of the headstones, a lot of the graves were disturbed during this time, and we don't actually know where Oliver Cowdery rests during this time. The church came back and turned the location of the cemetery into a park that it still maintains to this day. They found the existing headstones, you can see one right here, and cemented them into the ground so they wouldn't be lost again. But they chose right next to this particular small park to put the monument to the three witnesses, and on it is inscribed the testimony of Oliver Cowdery. Now, David Whitmer is the toughest of the three to kind of figure out. Whitmer is excommunicated in 1838. Unlike Oliver Cowdery and Martin Harris, he never rejoins the church. He lives longer than any other witness and is interviewed more than any other witness. There is a book called David Whitmer Interviews that's about this thick, that just has all the records of people that stopped in at various times and spoke to David Whitmer about his testimony. Now remember, this person, David Whitmer, is incredibly bitter at Joseph Smith, thinks that he's a fallen prophet. If he wants to discredit him, the easiest thing to do is to say it was all a lie. We all made it up. Instead, this is his testimony as shared with James R. Hart on August 21st, 1883. He said, "Our testimony is true, and if these things are not true, there is no truth. And if there's no truth, there's no God. And if there's no God, there's no existence. But I know there is a God, for I have heard his voice and witnessed a manifestation of his power." Even outside of formal settings, David Whitmer bore his testimony of the truth of the Book of Mormon. In fact, one story that you may have read in Saints this week that is particularly potent was only discovered in 2012. There's a record from a man named William McClellan. McClellan is one of the first apostles in the church. He's in the original Romans 12. Later on apostatizes from the church, but he does record this experience. Again, we didn't know about this until 2012. He said, in 1833, when a mobbing reigned triumphant in Jackson County, Missouri, when the Saints were under attack, he said, "I and Oliver Cowdery fled from our homes for fear of personal violence on Saturday, the 20th of July. The mob dispersed, agreeing to meet again the next Tuesday. They offered $80 reward for anyone who delivered Cowdery or McClellan in Independence on Tuesday. On Monday, I slipped down into the Whitmer settlement." He goes to the place where the Whitmers are living. "And there in the lonely woods, I met David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery. I said to them, 'Brethren, I've never seen an open vision in my life. You men say that you have, and therefore you positively know. Now you know that our lives are in danger every hour if the mob can only catch us. Tell me, in the fear of God, that the Book of Mormon, is the Book of Mormon true?' Cowdery looked at me with solemnity depicted in his face and said, 'Brother William, God sent his holy angel to declare the truth of the translation to us, and therefore we know, and though the mob kill us, yet we must die declaring its truth. David said, Oliver has told you the solemn truth, for we could not be deceived. I most truly declare to you that it is truth,' said I, 'and boys, I believe you. I could see no object for you to tell me falsehood now when our lives are in danger.'" So in the woods, with a mob kind of threatening and chasing them, William McClellan asked, "Is this really true?" And under those circumstances, both David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery say, "Yes, it's true. We can't deny it even if a mob threatens us." One of the most powerful experiences of my life was to go to Richmond, Missouri. Outside of Richmond, you can find the cemetery there up on a little hill. There is David Whitmer's headstone. David Whitmer was buried here after he passed away, and chiseled into the side of his headstone is this statement: "The record of the Jews and the record of the Nephites are one. Truth is eternal." So this is a person who left the church, who never rejoined, who had no motive to prop up Joseph Smith if it's not true, and yet bore testimony to the end of his life and beyond by engraving it into his headstone that he believed the Book of Mormon was true. Now, real quick, before we wrap up, let's talk about the 8 witnesses. A monument to the 8 witnesses was finally put up about 20 years ago in Liberty, Missouri. And the general rule with the 8 witnesses is that they were Smiths or they were Whitmers. So you can see on this side, Joseph Smith Sr., Hiram Smith, and Samuel Smith, you can see on this side, all the Whitmer brothers, Christian, Jacob, John, and Hiram Page, who is a Whitmer brother-in-law. He's married to Catherine Whitmer, one of the other Whitmer sisters. Their witness has appeared in every copy of the Book of Mormon since it was first published in 1830. And as a general rule, the Smiths stayed in the church, the Whitmers left the church. The Whitmers all left the church together. The notable exceptions here are Christian Whitmer and Peter Whitmer, who both die before 1838 when the Whitmer family leaves the church. We don't have any record of the 8 witnesses ever denying their testimony either. Their experience is a little bit different. According to Lucy Mack Smith, a few days after the 3 witnesses have their experience in Palmyra, near the location where the Book of Mormon had been hidden for millennia, Joseph Smith takes these men into the woods. There's no angel, there's no voice of God, there's nothing miraculous. He just hands them the plates, and they get to handle the plates. None of these men ever deny their testimony of the Book of Mormon. John Whitmer, who leaves the church and never comes back, in 1836 says, "I have most assuredly seen the plates from whence the Book of Mormon is translated, and I have handled these plates, and know of a surety that Joseph Smith Jr. has translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God." If you go to Excelsior Springs, Missouri, in a lonely little spot on the side of the road is the grave of Hiram Page, where a monument was placed a few years ago to recognize who he was. Hiram Page in 1847 said, "As to the Book of Mormon, it would be doing injustice to myself and to the work of God in the last days to say that I could know a thing to be true in 1830 and not know the same thing to be false in 1847. It would be treating the God of heaven with contempt to deny these testimonies, and too many others to mention here." Now you wonder about those Whitmer brothers that passed away before we could really sit down and talk with them. A man named David Marks actually visited the Whitmer farm in 1831. This is the year after the Book of Mormon is published. And he talks about sitting with all of the Whitmer sons. In fact, he mentions, "I went to a meeting in Fayette and tarried at the house of Mr. Whitmer. I saw 2 or 3 of his sons. We're assuming Christian and Peter are among them. And to others of the 8 who said they were witnesses of a certain book just published called the Golden Bible or the Book of Mormon. They affirmed that an angel had showed them certain plates of metal having the appearance of gold, and on these plates was written a history of the 10 tribes of Israel which were lost, and revelations to different prophets that arose among them." Now, he got a couple of details there wrong, but that's okay. As early as 1830, all the Whitmers are testifying that the Book of Mormon is true. The other witnesses of the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith Sr., Samuel Smith, Hiram Smith, all bear witness that the Book of Mormon is true to the end of their days. In fact, you'll note if you read section 135 of the Doctrine and Covenants that Hiram Smith is reading the Book of Mormon the day that he is killed in Carthage jail. Elder Holland, several church leaders have pointed out that at the edge of death, near the end of their lives, for these people to still be testifying that the book is true is remarkable. That they had a testimony that the book was true and felt very, very strongly about their witness of the Book of Mormon and the obligation that they had to others to bear their testimony that it's true. And I want to add at the end of this lecture, my witness too. I didn't see the plates or see the angel, I've just read the text. And I would say to anybody that doubts the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon, have you read it? If you're doubting now, have you read it recently? Do you study it on a regular basis? There's no way that a book of that complexity, of that beauty, and of that power that bears witness of the Savior Jesus Christ could have been produced in the time frame it was, unless it was anything short of a miracle. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Now, real quick, I'm going to put up here on the screen really fast again our readings for next week. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about the restoration of the priesthood and the historical sources surrounding it. These will be in your folder. As you open it up, you'll see readings there. I want to thank all of you for participating wherever you're at and for all the good work that you do out in the world to make things better and to help others. Please be safe, stay sound wherever you're at, and take care of one another.